The Senate Foreign Relations Committee chamber fell into an eerie silence as Secretary of State Marco Rubio leaned back in his chair, his face draining of color. Just moments earlier, he had confidently dismissed Representative Nancy Mace's questions about his China policy as uninformed speculation. Now, as Mace slowly opened a classified folder marked Confidential Donor Networks, Rubio's hands gripped the table. What she was about to reveal would not only expose contradictions in his tough-on-China rhetoric, but would trace millions of dollars flowing from Chinese-connected entities directly into his political operation. The cameras captured every second as Rubio realized he had walked into a trap of his own making. The morning had started differently. Marco Rubio arrived at the Hart Senate office building with his usual confidence, surrounded by a team of advisors carrying briefing books and talking points. At 53, the former senator from Florida had reached the pinnacle of American diplomacy. His appointment as Secretary of State under the Trump administration had been celebrated by Republicans as a triumph of hawkish foreign policy thinking. Rubio had spent years building a reputation as one of Washington's fiercest critics of the Chinese Communist Party, delivering speech after speech warning about Beijing's influence operations, economic warfare, and technological theft. The hearing was supposed to be routine, a quarterly update on the State Department's activities. Rubio had testified before Congress hundreds of times during his Senate career. He knew the rhythms, the predictable questions from friendly Republicans, the more pointed inquiries from Democrats that he could deflect with practiced ease. His preparation team had anticipated every possible line of questioning. What they had not anticipated was Nancy Mace. Representative Nancy Mace sat 3 rows back in the committee room, her blonde hair pulled back in a professional style, wearing a navy blue suit that conveyed both authority and accessibility. At 47, the South Carolina Congresswoman had already earned a reputation as one of the House's most unpredictable members. She was a Republican like Rubio, but that partisan alignment had never stopped her from asking uncomfortable questions when she believed principles were at stake. Her background as a businesswoman and her status as the first woman to graduate from the Citadel's Corps of Cadets had instilled in her a refusal to accept easy answers or defer to authority simply because of titles or positions. Mace had been preparing for this hearing differently than her colleagues. While others reviewed State Department budget documents and diplomatic initiatives, she had spent weeks following a different trail. It started with a tip from a concerned constituent who worked in financial compliance, someone who had noticed unusual patterns in campaign finance disclosures. That initial curiosity had led Mace and her small team down a rabbit hole of shell companies, intermediary organizations, and carefully structured donations that appeared designed to obscure their true origins. The hearing room was packed. C-SPAN cameras were positioned at multiple angles, ensuring every moment would be preserved for the public record. Journalists from major outlets filled the press gallery, their laptops open and ready. This was a high-profile hearing featuring a Secretary of State who harbored presidential ambitions. The audience expected policy discussions about Taiwan, trade tensions, and diplomatic initiatives. What they were about to witness was something entirely different. For the first 90 minutes, the hearing proceeded exactly as Rubio's team had predicted. Republican committee members asked supportive questions about the administration's approach to countering Chinese influence. Rubio delivered his answers with polish, citing statistics about tariffs, discussing concerns about TikTok and Huawei, and emphasizing the administration's commitment to protecting American interests. Democratic members pressed him on human rights issues and questioned whether the administration's approach was too confrontational. Rubio handled these challenges smoothly, pivoting to talking points about strength and strategic clarity. Then it was Nancy Mace's turn to ask questions. The committee chairman, a senior Democrat, nodded in her direction. Mace adjusted her microphone, took a measured breath, and began speaking in a calm, steady voice that immediately commanded attention. "Secretary Rubio," she started, "thank you for being here today. I want to ask you about something you said in your opening statement. You emphasized your commitment to confronting the Chinese Communist Party's influence operations in the United States. You used the phrase "following the monies" to describe how we should track Beijing's attempts to shape American policy. Do I have that correct? Rubio nodded, seeming pleased with the question. It allowed him to reiterate one of his core themes. Absolutely, Representative Mace. We need to be vigilant about how the CCP uses economic leverage and financial influence to compromise American institutions and individuals. It's one of the most serious threats we face. Mace nodded slowly, as if considering his words carefully. I couldn't agree more about the importance of following the money, Mr. Secretary, which is why I've spent the past 8 weeks doing exactly that. The room's energy shifted slightly. Several reporters looked up from their laptops. Rubio's chief of staff, sitting directly behind him, leaned forward with a concerned expression. I'm going to ask you a series of very specific questions. Mace continued, her voice still calm but gaining an edge of steel. And I want to emphasize that everything I'm about to reference is documented and verified. First question, are you familiar with an organization called the Pacific Bridge Initiative? Rubio paused for just a fraction of a second, a hesitation that trained observers would notice. I'm familiar with many organizations, Representative. Could you be more specific about the context? Let me help refresh your memory. Mace replied, Pacific Bridge Initiative is a think tank based in Virginia. According to its public filings, it focuses on promoting trade relationships between the United States and Asia-Pacific nations. Between 2019 and 2023, this organization donated $1.7 million to your various political committees. Does that help you remember? Rubio shifted in his chair slightly. Representative, I receive support from many organizations that share my views on trade and foreign policy. I don't personally manage the details of every contribution. Of course not, Mace acknowledged. That's what campaign finance directors are for. But here's what's interesting, Mr. Secretary. I had my team examine Pacific Bridge Initiative's board of directors and funding sources. Would you like to know what we found? Before Rubio could answer, Mace reached for the folder that had been sitting closed on the table in front of her throughout the hearing. It was a thick manila folder, clearly containing substantial documentation. The label on its cover was visible to the cameras, Confidential Donor Networks. Rubio's lead attorney, seated at the end of his table, immediately stood. Mr. Chairman, I object to the introduction of classified materials without proper clearance protocols. The chairman looked to Mace, who was already prepared for this response. Chairman, nothing I'm about to present is classified. These are publicly available documents that my office obtained through legal research, including corporate filings, tax records, and campaign finance disclosures. Every piece of information here is part of the public record. It just hasn't been compiled this way before. The chairman nodded. The representative may proceed. Mace opened the folder with deliberate slowness, the rustle of papers audible in the now silent chamber. She removed the first document, a corporate structure chart that she held up for the cameras to see. Pacific Bridge Initiative, she explained, is technically an independent organization. But when you trace its funding, something fascinating emerges. 63% of its budget comes from just 4 donors. And those 4 donors are all subsidiaries of Evergreen Capital Holdings, a private equity firm based in Delaware. She paused, letting that information settle before continuing. Now, Evergreen Capital Holdings is also an American company, at least on paper, but the majority ownership of Evergreen Capital Holdings is held by Crimson Dynasty Investment Group, which is registered in the Cayman Islands. And Crimson Dynasty's largest investor, holding a controlling 48% stake, is Chen Maritime Limited, which is headquartered in Hong Kong and has direct ties to the Chinese Communist Party through its board composition. The room erupted. Reporters began typing frantically. Committee members leaned forward in their seats. Several of Rubio's advisors were now huddled together, whispering urgently. Rubio's face had gone from confident to carefully neutral, the expression of a seasoned politician trying to maintain composure while his mind raced to calculate his next move. His hands, which had been resting casually on the table, were now gripped together tightly. Representative Mace, Rubio began, his voice measured but with a note of tension underneath. What you're describing is a complex chain of corporate ownership that doesn't prove any direct connection to. I'm not finished, Mr. Secretary, Mace interrupted calmly. That was just one organization. Let me tell you about the others. She pulled out another document, this one with highlighted sections clearly visible. The American Century Foundation, $2.1 million in contributions to your political operation. The Heritage Commerce Alliance, $1.4 million. The The Freedom and Prosperity Council, $900,000. Should I continue? Rubio said nothing, his jaw tight. I had a team of researchers spend weeks tracing the funding sources for each of these organizations. Mace continued. And do you know what we found, Mr. Secretary? Every single one of them, when you follow the money through enough shell companies and holding groups, traces back to entities with significant Chinese connections. Not Russian connections, not Saudi connections, Chinese connections. The very country you've built your entire foreign policy reputation on opposing. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the usual background noise of shuffling papers and whispered conversations had stopped. Every eye was on Marco Rubio, waiting for his response. Marco Rubio's carefully constructed facade began to crack. The polish that had carried him through decades of political combat was showing its first real fractures. His communications director, a young woman who had worked on 3 presidential campaigns, was typing frantically on her phone, likely alerting the broader team that they had a crisis situation developing. The usual playbook for handling difficult congressional testimony wasn't going to work here. This wasn't about policy disagreements or partisan point scoring. This was about documentation, money trails, and the kind of hypocrisy that could end careers. Representative Mace, Rubio finally responded, his voice tight with controlled frustration. You're engaging in exactly the kind of guilt by association tactics that I would expect from guilt by association. Mace cut him off, her tone sharpening for the first time. Secretary, I haven't even gotten to the associations yet. What I've just described is money. Actual dollars that flowed into your political operation from entities connected to the Chinese government. That's not association, that's transaction. She pulled out another document, this one appearing to be a timeline with dates and amounts highlighted in yellow. Let me make this even more specific. On March 15, 2022, you gave a major speech at the Reagan Library. Do you remember that speech, Mr. Secretary? Rubio nodded cautiously. I've given many speeches. I'd need to review the specific content to allow me to refresh your memory. Mace interrupted smoothly. In that speech, you called for the most aggressive sanctions regime against China that America has ever implemented. You specifically called out American businesses that prioritize profit over national security. You said, and I'm quoting directly here, any American who takes Chinese money while claiming to fight for American interests is a traitor to our values. Those were your exact words, Mr. Secretary. I have the transcript right here. The implications hung in the air like smoke. Reporters in the press gallery were now openly staring, some with their mouths slightly open. This wasn't just good television, this was a potential career-ending scandal unfolding in real time. Now, here's what makes that speech particularly interesting. Mace continued, her rhythm building like a prosecutor laying out a closing argument. 11 days before you gave that speech, on March 4th, Pacific Bridge Initiative transferred $250,000 to your leadership PAC. 18 days after your speech, on April 2nd, American Century Foundation contributed $300,000. The timing is fascinating, don't you think? Rubio's lead counsel was now writing notes furiously and sliding them across the table. Rubio glanced at them but seemed to decide they offered no viable escape route. He took a sip of water, his hand slightly unsteady before responding. Representative, campaign finance laws are complex. Contributions go through multiple levels of review. I don't personally approve or track every donation. That's handled by compliance professionals who ensure everything meets legal requirements. I'm sure it does meet legal requirements. Mace agreed, her tone almost sympathetic. The people who structured these donations knew exactly what they were doing. They created enough layers of separation to provide plausible deniability. Shell companies, think tanks, advocacy organizations, all technically legal, all carefully designed to obscure the original source of the money. It's actually quite sophisticated. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze locked on Rubio. But just because something is legal doesn't make it ethical, Mr. Secretary, and it certainly doesn't make it consistent with the tough-on-China image you've spent years cultivating. The Democratic chairman, sensing the historic nature of the moment, decided to let Mace continue beyond her normal time limit. Several Republican committee members looked uncomfortable, torn between party loyalty and the damning nature of the evidence being presented. A few were already checking their phones, likely calculating how to distance themselves from what was becoming a public relations disaster. Nancy Mace reached into her folder again, this time pulling out what appeared to be photographs. "Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter these into the record as well." The chairman nodded. Without objection, Mace held up the first photograph, large enough for the cameras to capture clearly. It showed Marco Rubio at what appeared to be a private dinner, sitting at a table with several other men in business attire. The setting was elegant, crystal glasses, fine china, ambient lighting that suggested an exclusive venue. This photograph was taken on June 8, 2023, at the Mandarin Oriental in Washington, D.C. Mace explained, "That's you, Mr. Secretary, dining with Kenneth Chen, the CEO of Pacific Bridge Initiative. Also at the table is David Huang, who serves on the board of American Century Foundation. And that gentleman on your right is James Wang, a principal at Evergreen Capital Holdings." She let the image speak for itself for a moment before continuing. "All three of these men are connected to the organizations that have funneled Chinese money into your political operation. And all three were sitting with you at a private dinner that, according to your official calendar obtained through a FOIA request, was listed only as personal time." Rubio's face had gone from pale to flushed with anger. "Representative Mace, are you seriously suggesting that I can't have dinner with constituents and business leaders without—" "These aren't your constituents, Mr. Secretary," Mace interrupted. "You represent the United States of America now, not Florida. And these aren't just business leaders. They're intermediaries for Chinese capital trying to influence American policy." She pulled out another photograph, this one showing Rubio at what appeared to be a conference or summit. "This is from the Asia-Pacific Economic Forum in Singapore, September 2022. You attended as a senator and keynote speaker. Your travel was arranged and paid for by the Pacific Economic Council. Care to guess who funded that organization's operations?" The pattern was becoming impossible to deny. Everywhere Rubio had gone, every speech he had given, every political operation he had run, Chinese-connected money appeared to be flowing in the background, hidden behind layers of corporate structures but present nonetheless. A junior Republican member, clearly uncomfortable with the implications, raised his hand. "Mr. Chairman, I have to ask, is Representative Mace suggesting that the Secretary of State is compromised by a foreign power? Because that's an extraordinarily serious allegation." Mace turned to address her colleague directly. "I'm not making allegations, I'm presenting facts. The Secretary can explain what these facts mean. But what I will say is this: if any other American politician had accepted millions of dollars from Chinese-connected sources while simultaneously claiming to be Beijing's fiercest opponent, we would be asking very hard questions about their true loyalties. I don't see why Secretary Rubio should be exempt from those same questions." The hearing room's energy had completely transformed. What began as a routine foreign policy briefing had become something far more consequential. Cable news networks were now running breaking news banners. Political Twitter was exploding with reactions. Within minutes, #Rubio China was trending nationally. Marco Rubio made a decision. He could continue trying to deflect and defend, watching the hole get deeper, or he could attempt to seize back control of the narrative. He chose confrontation. "Representative Mace," he said, his voice rising with indignation, "what you're doing here is a disgraceful smear campaign based on cherry-picked information and conspiracy theories. You're taking legitimate business relationships and donors who support my policy positions and twisting them into some kind of corruption narrative. This is exactly the kind of partisan witch hunt that undermines serious foreign policy discussions. It was a calculated gamble to paint Mace as the unreasonable one, the conspiracy theorist, the partisan hack. Paint this about her credibility rather than his compromises. In normal circumstances, it might have worked. Marco Rubio had significant credibility built over decades. Nancy Mace was a relatively junior member of Congress. The establishment instinct would be to side with the Secretary of State, but these weren't normal circumstances. And Nancy Mace wasn't finished. "A smear campaign," she repeated slowly, as if tasting the words. "Mr. Secretary, everything I've presented today is documented. Corporate filings, campaign finance records, your own official calendar, photographs from public events. None of this is speculation or theory. These are facts." She reached into her folder one more time, and everyone in the room could sense that whatever she was about to reveal would be the most damaging yet. Her hand emerged holding a slim envelope, the kind used for personal correspondence. "I want to be very careful here," Mace said, her tone becoming more serious. "Because what I'm about to share is sensitive, not classified, but sensitive." She opened the envelope and removed what appeared to be a letter. "This is a communication from a whistleblower within the State Department. Someone who works in your department, Mr. Secretary, and who felt compelled to come forward because they believed the American people deserved to know the truth." Rubio's entire legal team was now on alert. His chief of staff had gone pale. Whatever was in that letter, they hadn't prepared for it. "Indigir the peltaba now, Wistances." This whistleblower, Mace continued, describes a meeting that took place in your office 3 weeks ago. A meeting with representatives from several of the same organizations we've been discussing. According to this account, the discussion centered on how to structure future donations to avoid the kind of scrutiny we're conducting today. There was conversation about using different pass-through entities, spreading contributions across more organizations, and improving the operational security of the donor network. The room exploded with noise. Reporters shouted questions. Committee members demanded order. The chairman's gavel came down repeatedly, sharp cracks that barely penetrated the chaos. Indigir the Chiam sat calmly amid the storm, the letter still in her hand, watching as Marco Rubio's world collapsed around him in real time. The chairman's gavel finally restored a semblance of order. But the atmosphere in the hearing room had fundamentally changed. This was no longer a policy discussion or even a standard congressional investigation. This had become a moment that would be studied in political science classes and replayed in documentary films for years to come. Marco Rubio, once considered a potential future president, sat frozen as the implications of the whistleblower letter began to sink in throughout the chamber. Nancy Mace remained composed, professional, almost serene in contrast to the chaos surrounding her. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, anticipating every possible response, every deflection, every attack. She knew that confronting someone as powerful as the Secretary of State required not just courage but meticulous preparation. One factual error, one overstated claim, and the entire narrative could collapse, making her the story instead of Rubio's compromises. "Mr. Secretary," Mace continued once relative quiet had been restored, "I want to give you an opportunity to respond to what I've presented. But before you do, I want to make something clear to everyone watching. This isn't about Republicans versus Democrats. This isn't about supporting or opposing the current administration. This is about a fundamental question: can we trust our leaders to mean what they say? Can we believe that their public positions reflect their private actions?" She gestured toward the stack of documents now spread across her table. "You've built your entire political identity on being tough on China. You've questioned other people's patriotism, their commitment to American interests. You've demanded investigations into Chinese influence operations. And all the while, millions of dollars connected to Chinese entities have been flowing into your political operation." Rubio finally found his voice, though it lacked his earlier confidence. "Representative, you're conflating legal campaign contributions from American organizations with foreign influence. These are domestic entities that happen to have international business relationships. That's how global commerce works." "Is it?" Mace challenged. "Because I have communications here that suggest otherwise. Emails between these organization leaders discussing how to maintain access to you, how to ensure their investment pays dividends and policy outcomes. These aren't the words of people engaging in civic participation, Mr. Secretary. These are the words of people who view political contributions as business transactions." She held up another document, this one clearly an email chain with several messages visible. "This email is from Kenneth Chen, the CEO of Pacific Bridge Initiative, to David Huang. The date is July 2023. Mr. Chen writes, and I quote, 'The senators, that's you, before your appointment as secretary, understands the importance of maintaining stable relations. Our recent contribution has been noted and we should see favorable positioning on the Taiwan issue.'" End quote. The words hung in the air like an accusation that couldn't be taken back. Favorable positioning on Taiwan in exchange for contributions. This wasn't just about hypocrisy anymore. This was potentially about foreign influence on one of America's most critical national security issues. Several Democratic committee members were now demanding that the Justice Department launch an immediate investigation. Republican members sat in uncomfortable silence, calculating the political costs of either defending Rubio or abandoning him. The partisan divides that usually defined congressional hearings seemed to be dissolving in the face of the evidence. Rubio's chief counsel whispered urgently in his ear. The message was clear in his body language: stop talking, invoke executive privilege, end this hearing. But Rubio, perhaps out of pride or perhaps calculating that silence would be interpreted as guilt, chose to continue fighting. Those emails, if they're even authentic, represent the views of private citizens, not mine, Rubio insisted. I can't control what donors think or what they write in private communications. My policy positions on Taiwan have been consistent for years and are based on American interests, not campaign contributions. Have they been consistent? Mace asked, her tone suggesting she had evidence to the contrary. She was right. She pulled out yet another document, this one appearing to be a legislative record. In 2021, you co-sponsored the Taiwan Defense Act, which would have committed the United States to defending Taiwan against Chinese aggression. You gave passionate speeches about it, called it essential to American security. Then, in 2023, after receiving over $1 million from these Chinese-connected organizations, you quietly withdrew your co-sponsorship. Your office said it was due to evolving strategic considerations. Would you like to explain what those considerations were? The timeline was damning. Before the money, strong support for Taiwan. After the money, a softening position. Rubio could argue coincidence, but coincidence was becoming increasingly difficult to believe given the pattern Mace had established. The hearing room had become completely silent again, everyone waiting for Rubio's response. The Secretary of State took a long drink of water, his hand steadier now but his face showing the strain of someone who knew he was losing this battle. Foreign policy requires nuance, Rubio finally said. Positions evolve based on changing circumstances, intelligence assessments, and diplomatic realities. Suggesting that campaign contributions influence those decisions is insulting to my integrity and to the professionals at the State Department who provide analysis and recommendations. Then let's talk about your State Department, Mace replied, clearly ready for this deflection. Since you became Secretary of State 4 months ago, how many China hawks have been reassigned or pushed out of key positions? Rubio hesitated. Personnel decisions are made based on qualifications and departmental needs. I'll answer for you, Mace said. 7 senior officials known for their hardline positions on China have been moved to less influential roles or have resigned. Meanwhile, 3 new senior advisors have been brought in, all of whom have extensive business backgrounds in China and connections to the same investment networks we've been discussing. She let that information settle before delivering her final point. Mr. Secretary, this isn't about one dinner or one contribution or one policy shift. It's about a comprehensive pattern of saying one thing in public while doing another in private. It's about building a political brand as a China hawk while accepting money from Chinese-connected sources and then softening positions once that money arrives. The hearing continued for another hour, but the decisive moment had already passed. Marco Rubio's attempts to defend himself, to reframe the narrative, to attack Mace's motives, none of it gained traction. The evidence was too substantial, the timeline too clear, the contradictions too obvious. When the hearing finally adjourned, the fallout was immediate and devastating. Within minutes, clips of Mace's questioning were viral across every social media platform. Mace exposes Rubio became the top trending topic worldwide. Cable news networks devoted their entire evening programming to analyzing the revelations. Political commentators from across the spectrum struggled to defend Rubio's position. The White House issued a terse statement, saying the president had full confidence in Secretary Rubio, but Washington insiders recognized it as the kind of weak support that typically preceded a resignation. By evening, 3 Republican senators had called for an independent investigation. 2 Democratic senators went further, calling for Rubio's immediate resignation. Nancy Mace conducted a single interview that evening, appearing on CNN with Anderson Cooper. Her demeanor was professional, almost understated, letting the facts speak for themselves. When Cooper asked if she believed Rubio should resign, she chose her words carefully. That's not my decision to make, but I believe the American people deserve leaders whose private actions match their public rhetoric. If you're going to position yourself as tough on China, you can't simultaneously accept millions of dollars from Chinese connected sources and then soften your positions. That's not leadership, that's something else entirely. The interview clip was shared millions of times, with many praising Mace's measured approach. She had avoided hyperbole, stuck to documented facts, and let the evidence build its own case. It was a masterclass in effective congressional oversight. Over the following days, the investigations multiplied. The FBI announced a review of potential foreign influence violations. The Senate Ethics Committee opened an inquiry. Major newspapers assigned investigative teams to dig deeper into the donor networks Mace had exposed. Each new revelation seemed to confirm her core allegations. Marco Rubio's political operation went into crisis mode, but the damage was irreversible. Donors began distancing themselves. Political allies offered only tepid support. Within 2 weeks, anonymous White House sources were telling reporters that the administration was considering replacing Rubio. Within a month, those rumors became reality when Rubio announced he was stepping down to spend more time with family and pursue opportunities in the private sector. Washington code for a forced resignation. The Mace-Rubio hearing became a watershed moment in American politics. It demonstrated that careful investigation and documented evidence could still hold powerful figures accountable, even in an era of partisan divisions and political tribalism. It showed that credibility built over decades could collapse in hours when contradictions became impossible to deny. For Nancy Mace, the hearing transformed her national profile. She was invited to speak at universities, interviewed by major publications, and discussed as a potential candidate for higher office. But she largely avoided the spotlight, returning to her work in Congress and continuing to ask uncomfortable questions of powerful people. 18 months after the hearing, federal prosecutors announced indictments related to the donor network Mace had exposed, charging several individuals with violating foreign agent registration laws. The investigation traced over $40 million in Chinese-connected money that had flowed into American political operations through the same kinds of shell organizations Mace had identified. Marco Rubio, once a presidential contender and Secretary of State, had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of hypocrisy and the power of thorough preparation. Nancy Mace, the congresswoman who had been underestimated by Washington insiders, had proven that courage combined with evidence could still change the course of history. The marble halls of Congress had witnessed many dramatic moments over the centuries, but few as consequential as the day Nancy Mace opened a folder marked confidential donor networks and methodically dismantled the career of one of America's most prominent politicians. It was a reminder that in a democracy, no one is above accountability, and the truth, when backed by documentation and delivered with precision, remains the most powerful weapon of all. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth political analysis. Hit that notification bell so you never miss the moments that truly matter in American politics.